you're on fire, the next 10 seconds is more important than the next 10 years. The trouble with a lot of organisations is they don't give their teams the time to actually step back and do any sort of critical thinking about what we're doing. So all you end up doing is firefighting on a daily basis. And as I've said for decades now, your best firefighters are often your biggest arsonists.
Welcome to Chain Reaction, the podcast for the supply chain and logistics industry. If you enjoy this conversation, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chain Reaction podcast. I'm Michael Ostroumov. I'm CEO of Flox Logistics Marketplace. This podcast is brought to you by Flox as a way to engage with logistics and supply chain professionals, to explore ideas and people that are thinking and shaping the supply chain industry. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel. It helps us grow and it helps us reach more people who value practical and thought-provoking conversations we have around supply chain. Today, I'm joined by Sean Culey, a supply chain strategist with over 30 years of experience transforming value chains across the globe. Sean, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Michael. Nice to be here.
I'd like to start, as pretty much with all my guests, I'd like to start by asking you, how did your journey begin? How did you first get into supply chain? I've looked at your profile. You've pretty much have been your entire life in supply chain, in logistics. For many of my guests, and me included, it's been by accident. For very few, it's by choice, but I'd love to hear your story.
Yeah, I think that's probably by accident myself, really. I started off working in technology, so I was working in IT, and then I became involved in SAP in the early 90s, in the very early days of their implementations. And that's a modular system. I was responsible for sales and distribution, which is obviously part of the outbound flows. And then as I progressed and worked into areas like customer to cash. So I was involved in a very large, was the world's largest SAP implementation at that time for Cadbury Schweppes. It was a global implementation, and I was the design authority for customer to cash. And in the design of the processes, I realized that actually what was happening was they were, despite having sort of some big blue sky thinking, they were replacing functional silos with process silos. And I seem to have a somewhat unique ability, if I can call it that, to see that actually this wasn't going to really work. This integrated business system was only really going to work if we were integrated business. And that involves sort of linking together, long-term planning with, short-term execution. So I ended up being responsible for a series of processes called demand control. They were brand new. This was in the late 90s, very early 2000s. It's now called, I guess, sales and operations execution. Back then I called it demand control because the premise that I used was that you couldn't control demand, but you could control your response to it. So it was trying to move companies away from the sort of week 4 push and year-end push sort of hockey stick model. And I began to realise that actually the business fundamentally wasn't integrated, and that was a big issue. But we managed to do some fantastic stuff with Cadbury's globally. Worked in South Africa, worked in Australia, New Zealand, America, and the UK and Ireland. And we left there and went into, we formed a consultancy with 6 of my colleagues. We had a company called Seven, to try and help other organisations that had been investing, multi-million pounds into SAP, but weren't realising the benefits. And that wasn't so much to show them how the tool worked, as much as to help them with the strategic alignment and cross-process integration. So it's across the supply chain, we really came to understand that most of these things were a supply chain project, an end-to-end supply chain project, but most organisations were looking at them in little functional or process silos, and that was why it wasn't really adding any value for it. They haven't changed any of the underlying thinking or operating models when they implemented SAP on top of that. So I was responsible for some very large implementations at a time when I was CEO of Seven. And during that time, we came across the Supply Chain Council. So the global not-for-profit was responsible for the SCORE model at that time. I looked at that and went, had we known about this when we were working at Cadbury's, we'd have probably saved ourselves about £100 million worth of consultancy fees, because it enabled, rather than sort of coming up with our own nomenclature and coming up with our own process definitions, we could have just took this global standard and just focused more on how to do things better rather than just what to name things and how to call things, and then realizing that the marketing department was up in the clouds and the production department was down dealing with very, very granular levels of information, and it became very difficult to sort of line them up. So the SCORE model would have helped us significantly with that. I continued working with the Supply Chain Council, got on the European leadership, became the conference chair for Europe. And when I left Seven, I continued consulting in the supply chain area, both independently and through some of the bigger consultancies as well. And what I was trying to do, I guess, was help companies realize that supply chain isn't just about the movements of goods, but actually it's the realization of value and what is your value proposition and how it can help it. And actually, strangely enough, I ended up working then as a chief marketing officer for a software analytics company that was in the supply chain, because I was able to effectively help them to sell their software better than they could, because they were focusing very much on the technicalities and the functionality of this very, very brilliant tool that the founders had set up that sat on top of SAP. But they struggled to sell it at the C-suite because they were talking about functionality and features, and I had to really tell them that, to be honest, no one cared about that. They only cared about what it could do for them. It could integrate with its value. What did it do for my bottom line? How does it stop us from moving from a world of constant firefighting into one of actionable insight? And that was a really interesting, exciting opportunity. During the same time period, actually, one of the interesting things was I started writing a series of articles on organisational and cultural transitions and change and how to help companies, supply chain strategy, supply chain segmentation. So I got a bit of a niche on that. And then while I was the European chair for the Supply Chain Council, in 2012, hosted a session in Madrid where we brought in a lot of speakers around a new raft of technologies that were coming in. If you remember that time, so Google was experimenting with its autonomous cars and the LiDAR on top of the Priuses. Rethink Robotics had its Baxter robot. Amazon had just acquired Kiva Robotics, which is, when they sort of changed the paradigm from people walking to the inventory coming to them. Everyone was talking about big data. Everyone was talking about cloud computing. And I sort of mapped all of these technologies out and thought, "Ooh, this is really interesting. If I overlay this on top of the SCORE model, what I'm actually looking at here is a fully automated supply chain." Now, this was 2012. No one was talking about that. So I started writing and presenting about that. And to be honest, when I did, most people kind of lost their minds a little bit. They were like, "We've never heard anything like this. And what does it mean? And what subjects should my children study? And, is my job done for?" And they were asking really big macro questions. And I realised I didn't really know the answer to those questions. I had a point of view, but that was probably not as educated as I would like. So I then told my wife I was going to spend 3 months off work writing a book about this. And then as I was starting to write it, I realised that all I was really doing was describing the symptoms, but not understanding the cause and the cause of why is this happening right now. Because as I started working in the late 1980s, actually, all through the late 80s, 90s, most plans were basically last year's sales history with an aspirational percentage put on top of it. Nothing felt really disruptive. It was relatively linear. Whereas from 2012 onwards, post the financial crash, everything was hugely disruptive. This 3-month book then turned into a 6-year project as I went through trying to understand why all of this disruption was happening right now. And then, of course, I realised it still didn't answer the question that everyone was asking me, which is so what? And then I sort of spent a lot of time understanding that as well. So I ended up having a bit of a side career as a keynote speaker and writer and author of, talking about not just supply chains, but how supply chains exist within these macro forces that are changing the world, and why is that happening right now, and what does that mean for businesses? And then from then I've been working, on supply chain transformations, but really I try to focus not on it being a supply chain transformation, but being a business transformation, because what I'm focusing on getting companies to sort of base, their delivery system of value, i.e. the supply chain, around a really clear idea of what that value is. And most times they don't know. They know what products they sell, but they don't know why they sell it. So their network and everything is predicated around a distribution model that is really just based on, how things were just organically set up over time, rather than redesigning it in such a way to be a deliverer of value. And I think therefore I've got that sort of combination of business, marketing, sales, and supply chain background, which makes me a little bit unique, but it also makes it very awkward, I think, to define what my career has been, because it's been such a mad sort of variety of different jobs, including, I was supposed to be working on throughout Africa on all the English-speaking nations, working with what was the Supply Chain Council got acquired by APIX. APIX became ASCM, the Association of Supply Chain Management, and they hired me to basically spend about a decade working in all the English-speaking nations across Africa, working on the malaria elimination program, which was sponsored by the Global Fund and the Bill and Melinda Gates Association. And of course, halfway through the very first project, this little virus came out that you might have heard of, called COVID, that basically put paid to that. And then I did some work with the UN, helped the UN on their supply chain strategy in East Africa, then helped them on their sort of global strategic stock deployment. I'm quite good friends with the chief service officer of the UN. And now I work as a supply chain director for a research company in the UK called the Manufacturing Technology Centre. So it's been a bit varied. I wouldn't say it's a purist supply chain job. There's been a lot of consultancy in there. And there's been a lot of trying to think differently about what the supply chain is, and actually really talking about sort of value networks and getting sort of networks of value rather than just simply the movement of goods and services. So that, I think, is probably the longest answer you've ever had for that question, but I'll leave it there.
It is very close, yes, I can tell you that. But well, it's actually very very interesting when you talked about you started with what it sounded like a very technical kind of end of of the supply chain, and then you progress gradually into actually people and what people do and how they do and the kind of the processes, and it kind of brings it all together, which is kind of a fairly similar transition. I completely appreciate your comment about the value, because I mean, well, our business is called Value Chain Lab, so we didn't call it Supply Chain Lab; it's a Value Chain Lab, and the supply chains are essentially kind of, it's like a skeleton for the business. If it doesn't sit right, if it doesn't work right, then the whole business is unfortunately having quite a bit of trouble. And this is probably something that actually I'd love us to talk about today, is exactly how and this is very very topical, especially with the advent of AI and the popularization of the whole approach, is how to manage the purely technical data driven elements with the human side of things, and how to balance the two, because no matter how precise and perfect one side is, it can't live without the other. um, and more specifically, and we talked about before the podcast, we talked about some of the kind of the current environment and what the global supply chains are facing now. And it's a very very interesting term that you have mentioned. So we're all familiar with resilience. We're familiar with sort of with agility, but something that you've called anti-fragility or anti-fragile supply chains. So how do supply chains can be made to thrive through disruptions? You mentioned COVID. We see currently various kind of the geopolitical events that unfortunately either constrain some supply chains or have some disruptions in some other areas. So what do you mean by anti-fragility? Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that, and then how to thrive?
Yeah, I can do it, certainly. I mean, first things first, I didn't come up with the term. That was Nassim Nicholas Taleb in 2012 released a book called Anti-Fragile. Around about, I guess it would be 2020, 2021, I sort of had that sort of an epiphany as people coming out, with COVID, that this concepts that he talked about basically need going beyond resilience into and then actually evolving and thriving is something that actually there's a great opportunity for organizations to do. So um, I thought I was the only one, sort of that kind of had the penny drops moment that this book from a decade earlier had some philosophical ideas that applied to supply chains. Um, I've since found out a couple of other people have also sort of jumped on it. It's got its own little life as well across Europe. I think I'm not the only person who talk about it. Well, I do talk about it quite a bit in my talks at Cranfield University, something I didn't mention, by the way, when we went through my history. And and in my keynotes. And basically, so the world is now, as I'm sure you agree, is moving at an incredibly fast rate. So the future doesn't really look like the past anymore. And so if resilience is about returning to a previous state relatively undamaged, we're able to withstand an element of disruption and then return to that previous state without being fundamentally damaged, so without any sort of post-traumatic stress. Anti-fragility is about not only not having post-traumatic stress, but actually having post-traumatic growth. That the actual disruption itself enables you to learn by the volatility and uncertainty and actually adapt to that. So I use analogies. I quite like analogies. So I use sort of analogies of like a fragile company is like it's a sort of non-Newtonian liquid. So like oobleck, cornstarch and water. It's viscous, it's viscous. It flows like and looks like it's liquid, but it's very stiff and doesn't flow very well. And I think that describes most functionally siloed organisations, what I call fragile organisations. It's not that they're bone china, they don't drop them and they break, they operate, but everything takes longer than it should do, feels more frustrating than it should do, but things flow, products move out the door and everything happens. It just flows, not in a very organic or fast moving way. So and I'm sure you know that non-Newtonian liquids, when you put impact onto them, they stiffen, they form a solid. And that's kind of what happens in sort of fragile organizations is the moment pressure is applied, everyone just goes into their own little bunker, their own functional silo, thinks about, controlling costs and protecting their departments. As things stop flowing, things stop work, it actually makes things worse. So it doesn't really operate as well as it did previously, and previously it wasn't operating that particularly well anyway. So the disruption causes us a stiffening of the organization. Whereas a resilient oil company is like, I use like a Da Vinci bridge, so a self-supporting bridge, where the pressure, leans on the support functions, but it's still a bridge. And then when the pressure releases, it forms back into a bridge again. So the pressure actually strengthens the organization. And that's what we mean by resilience. It becomes strength. It can withstand the disruption. And then once it's gone, it just goes back to its previous state. And the analogy I like to use for anti-fragility is, it's probably not the best compared to the other two, but it's like the human muscular system. So if I started doing a series of sort of, very heavy bench presses, I'm going to cause trauma to my pectoral muscles. And then if I have enough protein, have enough sleep, it's going to repair itself so that the next time that disruption happens, I can withstand it. It becomes easy. I need more damage. I need more pressure in order to cause the same kind of trauma to my body. Because basically my body's evolved. It's become stronger. It's become more adapted to that. And that's kind of what I mean by anti-fragility, which is we don't just survive the disruption and go back to the previous state. We're actually learning from it, evolving and becoming smarter. So the next time a situation like that happens, we're not just ready for it, we're ready to take opportunity from it. How can we actually turn disruption as a threat into an opportunity?
Right. I don't know. That's very interesting. I've heard that term of anti-fragility, but not in relation to supply chain. And what you described is actually fascinating perspective. And I would probably use actually as you were talking, I would maybe use slightly different analogy. Yeah, I appreciate the analogy with the muscles, but it's also probably like with, I don't know, relationships or with failed businesses, because I'm entrepreneur and I had a failed business behind me a long time ago, but something that we learn from, something that it's the failure that teaches us so much. So going forward, we are different. So I understand there is the difference between anti-fragility and resilience in that sense. That the resilience is that I absorb the pressure and I push back and I get myself back into the same state that I was before, which does not necessarily imply that I've learned anything. I've resisted it.
Indeed, absolutely. And that's the point. That is the point. You don't necessarily become any smarter because you've managed to withstand it. Yeah, and I mean, I'm the same. The consultancy that I founded in 2006, I had to close it down in 2012 because the financial crash and the austerity measures that the UK undertook meant that the very large projects that I was leading for defence companies, they basically pulled the plug on all of those projects, which took my company down with it. And I look back at that as probably the biggest learning curve I've ever had. Yeah, the mistakes I made there could finish you. That could be it. I could go into a corner, lick my wounds, and never appear again. And a lot of people do. Or you dust yourself down and go, right. What can I learn from that situation? How, if I was to do that again, what would I do differently? How would I be smarter? How would we? And we might make completely new mistakes. I think that's part of the evolution process. But I'm not going to make the same ones.
You are listening to Chain Reaction. This podcast is brought to you by Phlox, the leading marketplace for the supply chain and logistics industry. Visit phlox.is to find out how you find the perfect supplier or make your services available to prospective buyers. Thanks for tuning in. Now back to the show.
Well, it's very interesting. But the other point that actually that you've mentioned, which is, and that's what interesting in terms of kind of our current environment. We're seeing a lot of disruptions. We're seeing a lot of changes, lots of constraints, lots of kind of headwind, as I say in the media. But you've also used previously the word thrive in this environment. So how you combine the two seemingly kind of conflicting elements. So one of the things I've just recently I've seen, oh sorry, my wife gave me a t-shirt as a gift that actually says, yeah, logistics is easy, it's like riding a bike, except the bike is on fire, you on fire, and everything's on fire.
Yeah, that feels awfully familiar. Absolutely, yeah. In fact, in the job I've got in the moment, I've got a very quite a challenging role in the company. The supply chain didn't really exist. It was mainly just a buying function, and I say it's very difficult sometimes to think more, to see the business thinking more than one step ahead, and it just feels like you're on fire and people just come up to you with cans of kerosene and start pouring it on top of you. That becomes very challenging. I think there's one of the questions, of course, is from an anti-fragile perspective, and this is where I do get a little bit annoyed, if I'm honest, because I see a lot of people talk about this now, but they stop at the bit that I've just explained, which is sort of what does it theoretically mean, but not how to do it. And because the really important point people want to understand is, yeah, I get that. That sounds really good. We need to thrive. We don't just want to survive. Yep, absolutely, thumbs up. How? How do we do that then? And of course, most people just go, well, that's for you to find out. I don't think that's sufficient. So I've been working for a while on sort of what does that actually mean? And because it's in a world where we're constantly surrounded by new software and new hardware, actually, I think what's really needed is new thoughtware. So it's a series of I call it sort of a series of cultural frameworks and then cognitive skills needed to become anti-fragile. So the cognitive framework is, and I'll just summarize it as sort of grit and growth. So grit is your resilience bit, the ability for the business to actually to withstand disruption. And in order to have grit, you need to have a purpose. So the organization needs to have a North Star to center itself around. Fragile companies often don't. Their North Star is what? Shareholder value, money, something like that. Well, that's very weak glue to bond together an organization. And then the growth bit is the sort of Carol Dweck mindset element of fixed mindsets versus growth mindset. So it's the growth mindset bit of the organization basically giving its people autonomy and also allowing them to go towards mastery in service of learning new skills and new ways of working in order to meet the purpose. So I'm mixing together about 3 different books here, really, that I'm quite fond of. One of which is Angela Duckworth's book on grit. Another one is Carol Dweck's book on mindset. And then the other one is Daniel Pink's book on drive, what motivates us, where he talks about the things that motivate people is a clarity of purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And I think they're sort of the subsets of the organizational framework that you need to set up. So, a real clear sense of purpose, followed by the freedom to experiment and be entrepreneurial in the service of that, but doing so in an aligned and integrated way. Otherwise, you just get chaos. You just get people running off doing their own little pet projects. In the middle of that, then, is these 5 cognitive skills that the convergence of them actually, I think, is what I would call enables you to be anti-fragile. The reason why they're in the middle, because unless your organization gives you the freedom to actually think about, as an organization, how you can service that purpose, and what the customer values and what they need and how you can work towards that, then actually all you're going to end up with is a lot of frustrated people who know they could do more but aren't given the freedom. And those cognitive skills are quite simply creative thinking. So it's the ability to, challenge assumptions, to look at the status quo, go back to first principles, think about how things, could be done. Systems thinking, the ability to think end to end, to look at unintended consequences, data feedback loops, understand how the system would work. Design thinking, the ability to emphasize with the customer, put themselves in the customer's shoes, understand what their wants and needs are, understand their frustration points. Creative thinking, which is the ability to rethink our ways of working based on these new technologies and new techniques that are available in the service of delivering needs for the customer across that new system that we've defined in a very, in a critically thinking way. And then finally, circular thinking, the ability to start moving into more regenerative feedback loops, not just thinking about linear push systems, but actually sort of, more circular business models. And the convergence of those coming together, I think, enables you to be anti-fragile. It doesn't necessarily mean you independently need to have all of those. It's just having them in the team of people that you're helping to run your supply chain.
Well, how do you apply this practicality? Because how do you apply this theoretical and well thought through kind of approach and thinking to practical challenges? We're still dealing with the echo of quite a big disruption that we have here on the island. So it's called Brexit. So we have exited, and I have spoken with quite a lot of importers as well as exporters that are dealing with it on a daily basis, with the challenges with the customs clearance. So some practical kind of the bits and the fires that they have to put out. So how can you get from a kind of a helicopter view of strategic thinking down to the immediate practical problems that needs to be solved tomorrow and the day after and the day after that?
The challenge I find in most organisations is that people don't have the time to step back. There's, like you say, when you're on fire, the next 10 seconds is more important than the next 10 years. The trouble with a lot of organisations is that, they don't give their teams the time to actually step back and do any sort of critical thinking about what we're doing. So all you end up doing is firefighting on a daily basis. And as I've said for decades now, your best firefighters are often your biggest arsonists, because they're saving today by stealing tomorrow. They're getting rewarded for it, and then they do it again, the next day. And I've had many situations in the sort of transformation programs that I've led where some of our biggest fans become our biggest enemies when they realise that control takes away some of the recognition that they get from being a firefighter. So there's people who I've dealt with in the past who basically say, I can't live like this. We're in complete chaos. We're in chaos every day. My stress levels are through the roof. There's no way out of it. And then I give them a way out. We work through it and we identify a different reality to that. And then they go, oh, so that means I don't need to, come in and save the day every day. No, you don't. No, strength. So we're in control now. Yeah, I'm not sure I like this. I quite liked it when I was the hero every day. I was quite liked it when people relied on me, and then you start sabotaging, strangely enough. So it's a really interesting human dynamic that I think in organisations that I think if anything with the things I've learned over the years are not systems or processes. They're not technology techniques or anything like that. They are psychology, and it's the human psychology aspects. So I think the going back to my sort of hypothetical framework where we start with purpose and the critical thinking element in the cognitive skills is we have to be able to have an honest conversation about what it is, who we are, what we're trying to achieve, what our problems are. So I've used the line now for a very long time is that you can't improve what you're unable to control, and you can't control what you don't understand, and it's very difficult to understand what you can't see. And the problem with most businesses is they can't see what's going on. They don't know where the supply chain starts. They don't know what the supply chain finishes. They don't know what the strategy is, and therefore they're in this chaotic state every single day where just surviving the day is generally, the sort of major sort of objective. But reverse is true. So visibility helps you to understand. Understanding enables control. Control enables improvement, and improvement enables multiple innovation opportunities to arrive. The hardest challenge is moving from the understanding to the control, because it means challenging paradigms, existing ways of working, status quos, sacred cows, a lot of which are cultural behaviours in an organisation that just you know um, enable people to continue to operate in a way that they know to be inefficient, they know to be not effective, but they don't know how to get out of it, and that's the challenge. So one of the skills I've developed over the years really is work, co-visioning and working with them on an alternative future that looks better than today. And the one thing I've learned over the years, painfully, if I can be really honest, is that you can't make people change. You try changing yourself. You should eat less chocolate. You should work out more. You should do lots of things, but it's difficult. Now try changing your partner. I mean, if I tell my wife she needs to change, that's not going to be a good conversation for me. So there is difficult to change yourself. They're very difficult to change others. So you think you can change an organisation? You can't. But you can create the environment where they deciding that the changing is in their own best interests, and being able to create that vision of a future state that they feel would be much better than the current state. In fact, only yesterday I was doing workshopping with my team, visioning for what the end of the 2027 looks like. In terms of, because we're going through a very, very rapid transformation. Sometimes it can feel a little bit disillusioned, because you present a future case that sounds great, but you're still stuck in the weeds. You're still fighting fires right now. But you have to keep reminding yourself of how far they've come, and how we can operate in a way that enables them to rise up and start doing the things that their job description said they were going to be doing. Because what I find most of the time is that most people in companies are actually doing something that wasn't on their job description. It was beneath their job description, and everyone's managing a level too low. And what they really want to be doing is rising up and managing higher than that, because that's what they thought they were doing. They thought they were going to be planning. They thought they were going to be training people. They thought they were going to be focusing on strategic delivery. They thought they were going to be doing personal development, and they're doing none of those things. They're just focusing on getting through the day. And you've got to create a future state that they deem as more beneficial to them than the current state, and you've also got to show them the direct alignment between their contribution and that future state. Because if you talk about technology as a great example, you start talking about robotics, artificial intelligence, the general reaction you're going to get back is fear. This is my job. My job's going to be automated in some way, and I'm not going to be necessary. So the reaction to fear is to not to be T-shaped, it's not to be integrated, it's to be very I-shaped and become very insular and protective. And that's not inducive to change. So it's more psychology than anything, I would say, Michael.
It is that there's a lot of psychology, and you mentioned a couple of really good points in terms of actually getting not just the North Star, not just the vision, not just have being inspired or enthused by what the future looks like, but also having a fairly clear understanding of this is where the starting point is, this is what I'm dealing with. I have a visibility, transparency of where I am today. I have a very clear understanding of the issues that I'm trying to solve, and then the path forward actually becomes more enthusiastic rather than kind of restrictive. But that brings us to the whole point of kind of the modern technologies and the data-driven thinking, data-driven decision making. So how, I mean, yes, AI is beginning to play quite a big role, but AI it's kind of sometimes it's what was the saying? It was one of the movies: extraordinary smart but amazingly stupid at the same time. Because yeah, you get to a position of garbage in, garbage out. If you feed very bad data, you're gonna get bad results. They either results that might sound smart, but they either going to be at best misleading, at worst damaging. So this is definitely one of the areas where people, but some organizations, again, this is a human element. They don't want to have transparency. They don't want to have visibility. They want to thrive in a firefighting mode where no one else can check their homework.
Yes, yeah, indeed. It's a challenge. I mean, I remember when I worked at Cadbury's, we were incredibly good in the UK. There was a whole team that was incredibly good at moving inventory around the network. So moving stuff between plant to plant and at incredible speed in order to fulfill a demand signal at one of the plants. And this whole team was constantly rewarded for its ability to, at 4 a.m. in the morning, get moved, containers full of chocolate from one place to another place. And because I was lucky enough to be involved in this global implementation where I was given a blank page and basically said redesign it, these demand control processes that I mentioned earlier, I had to talk to them and say, actually, what I want to happen is for kind of you not to exist. And which obviously isn't a great message, because every time you touch inventory, it costs money. So they were incredibly good chaos managers. We can manage chaos incredibly well. And I'm trying to say, I'd rather we weren't in chaos. How about we just move stock once? How about we moved it, came off the production line, went straight to the major retailers, and it didn't even go into our distribution network? How about that reality? Because the answer is that, well, then what do we do? That's a good question to answer. And because the answer is you do something else much more valuable than actually just incurring costs for the business, which is actually all they were doing. And that's quite a difficult transition for an organization to make, of course. And you've got to have leadership that's willing to challenge those sorts of major paradigm shifts in your organization. And when you come to technology, one of the things that I try to get companies to do is sort of step back and think about what are the key decision-making points that actually add value, to the customer and to you as in the organization. We sort of map them out. And interestingly, I look for keywords that the business says. So one of the keywords that I look for is, this is just common sense. Because the moment I hear that, I go, we're there. The moment someone internalizes this and goes, do you know what, this new way of operating is just common sense, means, they're there. Because again, one of the things I've learned is it's hearts first, minds second. That's why I say hearts and minds, not minds and hearts. Challenge with consultancies, it's all mind, it's all logic, it's a statistics, it's a network redesign based on numbers. And this is the problem with technology. Technology spitting out figures and facts, but there's no emotion. So the business is not connected to that in any way. So if there's no involvement, there's no commitment. And the moment people look at this and go, actually, this new mode of operation is just common sense and it makes logical sense, and I can see myself in it doing a different job to what I do right now, you're sold. That sort of famous word of buy-in. You've got that buy-in because now they emotionally feel that this is just common sense. And it's very difficult to then logic your way out of something you've just agreed is common sense and therefore logical. But if you start with that, if you do that to them, and this is where consultancies go wrong all the time, it's their solution. Here's our solution. We've solved your problems. Go implement. And they go, yeah, I wasn't involved in it. I'm not committed to it, and it sounds like it's just going to replace my job. So I'm actually, what I'm going to do is try and undermine it. I'm not part of the solution. This is a problem, not a solution to me. Technology is just a mechanism for being able to deliver something, and the question is what is that something? And most of the time businesses don't know, so they will be able to give you certain activities that they want efficiencies in, but not necessarily outcomes that they want to be effectively delivered. And the key point I'm going to talk about, decision driven rather than data driven, is what is the key decisions that deliver the outcomes that you actually want to achieve? And I asked, so there's two things there. One is a clarification of what the outcome is. So what is the strategy for your supply chain and how are you measuring it? And there's different, and then of course you ask the question, is that just for all supply chains or just for one supply chain? Because you've got more in your organization, and most businesses don't realize that. They think that's, which is why they have a one size fits all kind of model. And then secondly, what are the decisions that either move the dial on the delivery of that outcome, either positively or negatively? And then ask, what does a good decision look like there? And actually they don't know. They'll probably say, well, Bob makes the decisions, or so-and-so does some magic. And no, if you want a machine to help you here, you have to be able to codify the decision-making process in such a way that a good decision becomes a natural outcome. So you need to understand what data you need to understand what decision-making criteria you need to work on, you need to understand what levers you're going to pull. So if you're working on inbound supply, for example, and you're looking between sea freight or air freight, what is the impact on cost? What is the impact on carbon? What is the impact on lead time? Well, and then that depends on whether or not if you focus on carbon, which increases lead time because you move from air to sea, what's the impact on your work in progress and your raw materials, and does it have an impact on your finished goods stocks, and does it affect the customer? You have to understand all of that interconnectivity, and usually they're different decision-making groups and potentially in different countries who don't talk to each other very much. And that's where automation and becoming decision driven can really, really help, by the connectivity of decisions across the supply chain, looking at data in a way that's enabling you to make decisions that you couldn't make in isolation normally. But it does depend very much on your earlier point on the quality of the information and the granularity of the information and the frequency of the information that's going into the system, because, to make that, specifically in the world we are in right now where things change so incredibly fast.
Well, you've touched on quite a lot of issues, and there's definitely a lots of areas, and there's lots of overlapping issues or interconnected issues, interconnectivity between different areas, whether it's both anything from human end to the data driven end, and the operations and the clients and relationships in the middle. There's a lot of it's a massive zoo effectively of problems, and you've alluded to quite a lot of them. But one question that I like asking all my guests: if you had a magic wand and you can wave it and you can solve one particular problem that you think would be the most impactful, what would it be?
Good question. I mean, I've talked about psychology a lot, and I think I may have used the line that in order to make get real value from new hardware and new software, you need new thoughtware. And I guess the one thing, James, would be that from the leaderships of the organisation to change their mental operating model in such a way that they'll allow the latent talent in organisations to be freed in order to be able to deliver more value for those companies and for the customers. Because I think, and I generally believe, we have the cognitive capabilities to solve any of the problems that are in front of us right now, specifically with a lot of this technology that helps us. But we deny ourselves that opportunity generally through the leadership profiles and the way organizations are structured. And if I could have one wish, it would be to create an organization that would allow its people to achieve their true potentials and use these technologies and wonderful tools that we have in such a way to overcome whatever problems we might have in front. And if I had a second one, it would be for people to stop screwing everything up on a global basis all the time. But I don't think we could do much about that.
Well, you can't have everything, can you?
No.
No, but I completely sympathize with the point of, yeah, I've heard so many times, and in my consulting years as well, is like, well, that's not my job. That's not my job. That's not my job description. That's not what I paid for. Why would I step out? Why would I don't know, think about this while I'm paid for the firefighting here? So it is indeed a super massive challenge. But Sean, that was great, absolutely amazing to have you here. Thanks very much for joining the conversation, and for sharing your insights and perspective. And it's been a fascinating discussion. And to everyone else still watching and listening to us, thank you for staying with us. I hope you found this episode valuable, and I look forward to welcoming you again in the next episode of Chain Reaction. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you have a story or insights to share from your sector, we'd love to hear from you. Simply reach out to us through the links in the description. See you next time.